Have you ever lived off the grid? What are the weird things you've experienced while living off the grid? When I was 13 years old, my parents got this huge property that was totally off the grid. It was a big house on a large hectare of land, tucked in between the woods. Before my parents and I moved to our new house, we used to live in a bustling town and an extremely active neighborhood, where it was pretty difficult to have some peace and quiet. The neighbors around us were a horror, and we had our fair share of annoying neighbors. In the few years we lived there, we had to deal with the noisy ones, the irritating, loud ones, and the creepy ones. So moving to a quiet place had always been at the top of my parents' priority list, and thankfully, they were able to pull that off when I was 13. As I mentioned earlier, the house we moved into was in the middle of the woods. You literally had to drive for about 15 minutes from our house to get to the main road. But aside from being a nightmare to access the house by foot, the good thing was that there were no neighbors around us. Getting to the closest neighbor would take another 15 minutes of driving from our house and even more time on foot. I loved it there because the environment was serene and peaceful, and the site was another level of beauty, especially in the winter. From inside our kitchen and rooms, you could enjoy the majestic mountain view, and the best part for me was that unlike the previous house we lived in, there was plenty of space in the yard and front of the house to play. As for school, I had to change schools because we had relocated from the town where we lived, so my dad or mom had to drive me to school every day because the school bus wouldn't come down to where we lived. It was part of the school policy. Now, back to the house. Living so far from everyone was like a dream come true, and my parents and I totally loved it, even though we had to do a couple of things manually because the house was not so modern and most of the appliances were not upgraded. We didn't mind. It was far better to chop wood with an axe than live next to wild neighbors who threw house parties almost every day. For the first 3 years we lived there, we didn't have any issues. No animal attacks, no hikers wandering to our house, absolutely nothing at all. But when I turned 17, all of that changed. On Christmas of that year, I invited my cousin Rick to come and spend the short holiday with us. Rick and I had been very close since childhood, and our fathers had a great relationship. Initially, I planned to invite Rick during the summer season so we could go camping in the woods, but he never had the time because of his job. When Rick came that Christmas, I had imagined that all we would do was eat, play video games, and talk about boy stuff. But something changed our plans. The first night Rick came over, he found it very difficult to sleep, and as a result of that, he wandered around the house the whole of that night before he finally felt sleepy. The following morning, while we were all talking over breakfast, my dad teased Rick about living in a town full of neighbors and told him he would enjoy some peace and quiet in our house because we were the only ones who lived there. Immediately after my dad said that, Rick laughed and said, "What do you mean? You're the only ones who live here. I literally saw some of your neighbors outside last night." When Rick said that, we thought he was joking, until we saw the serious look on his face. My dad and I tried to tell Rick that it was impossible. He was imagining things, because we didn't have any neighbors close to us, except the one a few miles away. But Rick swore that he saw 3 people outside our house the previous night, and he ignored them because he believed they were neighbors walking around. He even said he could prove it to us. In a bid to prove what he had seen, Rick took us to the spot where he saw those people. To our great surprise, there were traces of footsteps on that spot, even though the snow had covered some part of it. That was not all. The footsteps walked around our house and went down a trail. The trail into the woods, but somehow, when it got to a certain point, they just vanished. Frankly, when Rick, my dad, and I returned to the house, 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. I kept thinking about who the people were and what they were looking for on our property. Accessing our property from the main road would take at least 25 to 30 minutes on foot, and the same duration as walking out. It didn't make sense that someone would walk all that distance for nothing. After we had thought of the possible reasons those people could have gotten so close to our house, my dad decided to ask Rick more questions. He asked Rick if he could describe them, or if he had heard anything they said, but unfortunately, Rick had very little information about them. We were a bit worried throughout that day, since it was the first time we had encountered something like that. My dad wanted to call the police and make a report, but my mom said it was too soon. She said there was a possibility that a group of hikers had lost their way, but that didn't explain the footsteps that walked around the house. After hours of tension, we finally stopped talking about it and carried on with our activities for the day. I won't lie, that night I stayed up so I could see if the same people would show up again, but they didn't. When that happened, I shrugged it off as hikers trying to find their way and completely forgot about it. It wasn't until something happened on the 26th. That day, I was feeling under the weather, which caused me to change my plans for that day. Since there were a lot of shows and events happening on that day in town, my parents and Rick left to attend the events, leaving only me at home. Exactly an hour after Rick and my parents left the house, I was in bed trying to force myself to sleep when I heard voices outside our house. Immediately after I heard them, my heart dropped because we had no neighbors around, and even if a hiker was passing by, he or she had no business getting so close to the house. While trying to figure out who they were, the next thing I heard was someone aggressively turning the doorknob. At that point, I realized they were trying to break into the house. At first, I thought of going into my dad's room to take his shotgun, but there were 3 of them, making it 1 against 3. 2 men looked like they were in their 30s, and the third guy looked pretty young. Thank goodness all the doors were locked, and the windows could not be opened unless they were opened from the inside. While one of the men was still trying to manipulate his way with the doorknob, I called my dad and told him that some people were trying to break into our house. I even texted everyone first before I called my dad, just in case he didn't take his calls. For the first time ever, I decided to do something brave because I knew it would take my parents about an hour to come home. To stop those thieves from getting into the house, I grabbed my dad's shotgun, opened one of the living room windows, and yelled in a deep voice, "If you take 1 step forward, you all won't be walking out of here alive." The moment one of the men heard my voice and saw the shotgun from the window, he yelled, "There's someone in the house!" And with that, they all scurried away like rats. By the time my parents arrived, they were already gone, but I was able to get a good look at one of them. We called the police and gave our reports, and they promised to search the area for any sign of them. Sadly, the police didn't find anything, except footprints that eventually disappeared in the woods. That was the last time I saw them. We still lived in that house for a long time, and we never had another issue of someone trying to break into our home.